no death. It is only a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Carol Ann is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Welcome to episode 81 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. Last week, we talked about the ability of musicians and artists to somehow reach into maybe the Akashic records or whatever it might be, the area of consciousness, this non-local area of consciousness that exists outside us. And their ability to be able to bring music or literature that's been composed either with unseen collaborators on Earth, but obviously happening somewhere in another dimension, and being able to bring that information back usually through channeling or astral projection or sleeping or just, I suppose, they call it divine intervention or inspiration. And being able to bring that music into their daily lives if they're musicians and compose it as if it's their own music, or if they're writers, to write what they have seen or transcribed in their minds if they can remember it. And obviously, quite often it might be imperfect. I had a little brief text conversation with Esther last night, the musician, as you know, and she actually indicated to me that there's quite a lot of evidence that various writers like Dan Brown or even Joanne Rowling have created literature that have caused some people to feel that it wasn't actually theirs. This has also happened with famous musicians over time, and this is not necessarily plagiarism. This is perhaps because they don't actually know for sure where that information that's come into their mind has come from. They've had the inspiration. They've probably sat for hours in front of a computer or in front of a piano or a guitar, and they've created this piece of art that they believe is theirs, and they're not really terribly sure when somebody pops up and says, actually, do you know what? I had those ideas, or I had that song, and you've copied it. And they don't quite know what to say at that point. Now, I know Paul McCartney and various other musicians throughout the history of certainly pop music and maybe classical music. I'm not very familiar with that. Maybe Esther can tell me more. But many of these composers have been accused of plagiarism, of taking somebody else's work and making out that it's theirs. Now, whether that's because they do it deliberately, which happens in some cases, or whether it's becoming something that they have no idea about because they brought it through and thought it was their own information. But in fact, they may have been part of a collective in the non-local consciousness realm and brought over something that other people also brought over. And ultimately, I suppose it's going to be a question of how well they can transcribe that information that determines how similar it's going to be to another person who would have transcribed the same information. I think that's quite a nice explanation for people who feel that there is plagiarism going on, even though they didn't do it themselves or are adamant that it was not plagiarized, that they just wrote this. Now, most definitely, Dan Brown has been taken to court, and he's actually won by a number of authors who claim that he stole their ideas. And I understand the same thing has happened to Joanne Rowling. So this must be happening a lot in the artistic realm, that people are being accused of stealing ideas from other people. But that could be because the other people are getting similar ideas. They're bringing the same ideas over from the non-conscious realm. So I just thought that was quite interesting to mention. And I mentioned to you listeners last week about a dream I had where there seemed to have been some form of communication between perhaps the American military and extraterrestrials. Sorry about all the noise in the background, but my dogs are going crazy. Without doubt, probably the majorly accepted form of psychic communication that has been discussed by the United States and other governments, and I think it is a thing that is, without doubt, been going on probably since the Cold War and before, is remote viewing. And remote viewing is clearly a psychic skill. It's the ability of taking a psychic who can potentially see something that is many, many miles away, and he can go through walls and everything else and be able to read documents. Obviously, Uri Geller made it very popular in the 70s when he said that he could see what was in sealed envelopes in another room in another city. But this is just an example of being able to get information that is remote from you. But unlike artists who are getting inspiration from the non-local consciousness realms, in this case, most remote viewers are getting information from the physical earth, of physical things that exist in locations somewhere that is remote from them. And they're being able to see it and to be able to write it down, what they've seen. And it was considered to be quite a useful skill, particularly in the defense realm. So this week I want to talk about remote viewing because it's very connected to the last two episodes, and it's also, if you like, a more of a real world application of the ability to receive, if you like, artistic information without actually physically seeing it or having it in your hand. So remote viewing isn't some form of party trick. This isn't some sort of weird esoteric psychic mumbo jumbo. This is not a fantasy, but this is a phenomenon that was very actively and quietly studied and funded and operationally used by governments, particularly during the Cold War, when the public was told that it was impossible. As they are now being told, it's pretty impossible to do that, and also that UFOs, UAPs are impossibly unreal, etc., etc. So this was just another catalogue in the sad history of governments covering up psychic phenomenon because they felt they could weaponize it and they didn't want to share it with anyone else. And sadly, that might well be the case with extraterrestrials or interdimensionals as well, and the crashed vehicles that have been retrieved. Remote viewing is the idea that a human mind can perceive people or places or events, and of course even beings across vast distances, without using the physical senses that we know. That you don't use cameras, you don't use microphones, there is no travel, there is no real detection. It's just using your consciousness. And obviously if consciousness can do that, then we have to ask that deeper question, one that brings us directly into the territory of my podcast, that if the mind is not bound by the body, what happens to it when the body dies? Remote viewing does not apparently look like visions in a movie. There's no crystal balls, there's no flashing images, no voices speaking clearly in the head. Instead, remote viewers describe these feelings of impressions, very fleeting, of textures, of temperatures, of emotions, movement, shapes. There is a sense they have that there is a picture there, rather than actually seeing that picture quite often. It's very subtle, and of course it's easy to dismiss, and maybe that's why it works so well. And in the 1970s, researchers at Stanford Research Institute were tasked with exploring whether human consciousness could access information beyond normal sensory limits. These weren't mystics or magicians like Uri Geller, although he was part of this research. Most of all, they were physicists and engineers, and their work was funded by the US intelligence agencies because of a growing fear that the Soviet Union was also pouring a lot of money into psychic research. Now, during the Cold War, there was no possibility that this would go unexplored because people were desperate to get that edge over their enemy. And what researchers found disturbed them, and under controlled conditions, certain individuals could describe distant locations with tremendous accuracy, and it was far beyond chance. They could sketch buildings they'd never seen. They could describe objects that were hidden in sealed containers. They could perceive events happening thousands of miles away. But perhaps most unsettling of all, they did this without knowing what they were looking for. Now, over the next 2 decades, the US military and intelligence community was busy quietly training what they called remote viewers under a program that would eventually be known as Stargate. Now, these viewers were tasked with finding downed aircraft or locating hostages, describing secret military facilities, or observing foreign military installations. Of course, sometimes they failed. But I interestingly watched a video on YouTube, and it was Jimmy Carter, when he was alive, describing how remote viewers were used to find a crashed military aircraft somewhere in Latin America. And everyone had spent a long time trying to locate this aircraft with absolutely no luck. And in the end, they must have resorted to using these remote viewers, part of the Stargate program. And the remote viewer came in and drew pictures. I think even managed to give almost map references as to where this person felt this aircraft was. And they sent aircraft or helicopters there to those specific areas, and they actually found this downed aircraft. And in fact, I think they found some survivors as well. So this must have really rocked the American military establishment into thinking, my goodness, there really is something way beyond what we see normally with our senses. So sometimes they succeeded so precisely that they could actually see a massive Soviet submarine construction facility before it was publicly known, for instance, or they identified the location of a kidnapped American general. Now, this worked, and they couldn't explain how, because this information can only be accessed, without space, distance, or time. So clearly they had to realize that the mind is not confined to the brain, and that it wasn't probably even particularly local. And that's why I'm very interested in remote viewing, because this was probably the origins of the programs that were used in the United States military that were most definitely using psychic abilities as their tools. And yet it's been covered up pretty much, although people know about it. But these types of science, if you like, which I explore in my podcast, are still ridiculed by other people who believe the government narrative that this cannot really happen. So really it was where science and spirituality began to overlap. In neuroscience, consciousness is usually treated as something produced by the brain, and as we said before, remote viewing suggests that's completely the opposite, that the brain may act more like a receiver than a generator, just as we said in the previous episodes. It's a kind of a radio receiver. It tunes into things. It doesn't create anything at all. And if the radio receiver breaks, the music doesn't necessarily stop. It just keeps playing elsewhere. Now, this idea isn't new. There were ancient cultures around the world who described consciousness as something that could leave the body, could travel, could observe and return. And I know the Egyptians, they called it Ba, or the Ba, and Hindus, they describe subtle bodies, and shamans speak of spirit flight, and we modern mystics, we call it astral projection. But remote viewing does strip away all this stuff about religious language and belief in anything that's about life after death or any of that stuff. And it replaces it with protocols and statistics and paperwork and administration in a scientific way. And it's something that Stephen Greer used later on when he tried to create the CE5 protocols that we've discussed before, that I used in Rendlesham Forest in order to try to make contact with UAPs. It's a psychic form of communication, and it's something that is completely real. Now, from what I've read, remote viewers insist that they don't leave their bodies. They remain seated. Their eyes are often open, sometimes closed, and they record their impressions on paper. Now, astral travelers are slightly different. They tend to leave their bodies, and they tend to do it in their sleep or in some form of trance. But the dissociation from our physical senses in order to access distant information is very similar. Now, it obviously raises the possibilities that if consciousness doesn't need to travel at all, and if distance is completely irrelevant, and then of course death may not be a journey either. This sense that when you die, your soul is moving somewhere else, it gives that wrong impression, probably, that there is a journey involved, when really it's not. It's all around us. So in that respect, the people who we call dead are existing, but within a dimension that is all around us, which again is a beautiful thought, and it links with that religious idea that everything is around us, that God is around us, and if you're a Christian, this is very, very familiar to you. It's just a question of being able to tune in to that consciousness around you. And as we've discussed before, eventually, I suppose, this consciousness, particularly of people who've passed on, gets weaker and weaker and weaker unless it's sort of reactivated or regularly used, mainly because the little energy that you're picking up is probably tiny in terms of the total energy of that person that's now spread out across infinitely sized realms of consciousness. Now, some remote viewing sessions went way beyond military targets. Viewers began describing non-human structures, environments that did not exist on Earth, beings that felt intelligent and aware, quite similar to the way that people have described being in a DMT trip. In one very famous session I read about, a remote viewer was asked to observe Mars, which is approximately 1 million years in the past. He described towering beings, advanced structures, and a dying world. Now, was this imagination? Was it symbolism? Or was it a general perception beyond time? And what troubled researchers most was not the content, but the reaction. Some viewers reported the sensation of being observed, as if whatever existed there was not passive, it was consciousness that can observe across dimensions. And so then perhaps consciousness can be observed in return. And with the research into quantum mechanics, one is always hearing about the importance of observation, and that consciousness tends to be available to us when it's observed, and not available to us when it's not observed. So again, it links to that idea that if you don't observe people who've passed on and the consciousness that they've left behind, then you cannot see it anymore. But if you do make a conscious attempt to observe it, then you can see it. So to me, in a way, remote viewing is sort of slam dunk proof that consciousness is not created by the brain, and therefore death cannot destroy it. And remote viewing has been used to observe past events, historical figures, deceased individuals. And when viewers do it, they don't just report scenes, they report the presence. They can feel the emotion, the personality, the awareness. And this mirrors what people describe during near-death experiences and mediumship, and what I do. It's this ability to be able to have spontaneous encounters with people who are deceased. So the difference is this: remote viewing does not require belief. It only requires attention. And if consciousness survives death, then the dead are definitely not silent. They are simply existing, as I know, on a frequency that most people rarely tune into. And so remote viewing is probably not so much about spying on enemies. It's also about remembering what we are. So in 1995, the Stargate program was officially shut down. So we know that. And publicly, of course, the reason was it was unreliable, they said. Privately, and many people disagree, they were obviously scared that remote viewing was working. But it wasn't that predictable. It couldn't be weaponized cleanly. It couldn't be controlled cleanly. And perhaps most importantly, it suggested something that civilization really publicly was not ready to accept that the mind is not confined to the body, that death is not the ending, and that we are far less alone than we think. Now, just because the Stargate program ended in 1995 doesn't mean that there were all sorts of programs that were still continuing. So we know, of course, of Stephen Greer, who was using his CE5 protocols. And we know from Stephen Greer and other people who've come forward, whistleblowers who've come forward, that the way that the extraterrestrials or interdimensionals that have visited us so far communicate with us is largely psychically. It's largely through remote viewing or through communication with our minds directly, through consciousness. And in this famous place called Skinwalker Ranch at the moment, where they're doing a lot of research, privately funded research, they are using summoning techniques, as we've done before, to get UFOs or orbs or UAPs, whatever you want to call them, to come to them, to make themselves visible. Now, there's an important distinction we need to make, one that often gets blurred when people talk about remote viewing and mediumship and communicating with the dead. Are we contacting the past, or are we contacting the dead? Now, at first glance, that may sound like the same thing, but they may not be, because when a remote viewer observes a historical event, like a battlefield, or a childhood memory, or a long-destroyed city, or even Mars 1,000,000 years ago, they often describe it as if it's still happening. It's not remembered, it's not replayed, but present. Now, that, of course, makes sense if you believe, as I do, that time is a continuous line of information that you can dip into and out of whenever you want to. It's not linear like we see it. It's happening simultaneously. Now, some researchers propose, therefore, that time itself may not move in the way that we think it does. So from this perspective, the past isn't gone. It's simply no longer now. It still exists, and it's still embedded in the structure of reality. It's a track that's already recorded, and remote viewing is just allowing us to go and look at that recorded track. And the whole of consciousness is divided into these conscious tracks, these recordings. So if you like, there's no spirits about it. It's not about surviving personalities. It's just information that's been preserved in time, because time is infinite and it's simultaneously happening, but we can jump in and out and see different parts of it using astral projection or psychic phenomena. And it would certainly change a lot of people's views on religion and psychic phenomenon if they understood that. But when people describe seeing deceased people, something does change. They don't just see the scenes. They report this idea of emotion and awareness, and they have a sense of being met quite often rather than observed. And quite often there's this sense of an interaction and being able to talk. So the dead in these experiences are not memories. They're not echoes. They're not static. They appear to be real and responsive. And this, of course, aligns with theories of consciousness that suggest awareness is not bound to time the way matter is, that consciousness may exist in a continuous state, while the body simply drops out of the equation. So in this model, remote viewing the past is like watching a recording. And I had that feeling, of course, a year or so ago, when I think it was Neil Peart who explained to me, or somebody explained to me, that when you're contacting someone who is passed on, yes, you are like opening a channel to that person, but in a way you are dealing with a recording. I think it was described as like a bot, an internet bot to me, that has all the consciousness of that person and everything up to the point that he died. So you're able to communicate with that person as if he was still alive. But his life ended at a point, and you can't obviously talk to him about things after that in human terms, because he is no longer human. But you can talk to the person and you can interact as if he was alive up to the point that he died, if that makes sense. So remote viewers are taught often really not to engage with people that they come across, or to converse or to reach out, because it's believed that the observation is one thing and interaction is another. And I don't know why they decided to do that. I think it's perhaps it opened a whole moral line that perhaps was slightly uncomfortable to science. So throughout history, nearly every spiritual tradition has also warned us about confusing observing and communicating with spiritual entities. It's because I think some people are terribly frightened of the fact that you could be talking to demons or you could be talking to angels, and it becomes so clouded and so full of religious dogma that it starts scaring people, and they start really digging into their fears that have been generated through Bible studies or through watching horror films. And it becomes less serious at that point, that you're perhaps contacting evil spirits that could mean you harm in some way. And of course, there's a whole realm of stuff out there with black magic and the occult, which reinforces this and makes people feel that you're not communicating sometimes with people who wish you well. They may wish you harm. So again, I think, as is happening now with the UAP movement, the religious people are getting involved. They are having a tremendous, I believe, say in what is going to be disclosed. People are beginning to believe that the factions who observe UAPs or interdimensional beings or technology that indicates psychic ability, the religious people are falling into one camp and describing it as being clearly of a religious origin, but maybe related to fallen angels or devils and stuff. And they're seeing it in terms of their religious beliefs. While science, that is only just starting to come around to it all, will start seeing it in terms of, the sort of energy and the quantum mechanics of it all. So I am obviously pretty much, I suppose, within these two camps, because I most definitely believe in the spiritual and the religious aspects of things, but equally I do believe that it's all explainable to a certain degree in scientific ways, but our science is not really far enough advanced to be able to describe it, and when we haven't really got the right language, and we've discussed that before as well. So yes, that is where we are, is that the whole program officially was stopped because of fear, potentially, of what this might unleash, that it might make people question religion. And it's the same thing that has happened with the UAP movement, is that it's being bogged down, I believe, in the United States government, the disclosure movement, that is, primarily by people, and they've even said Mormons are doing it. I don't know why, but there is a link between Mormonism and UAPs. We've discussed that as well. But there is a belief that the religious right, which is very, very powerful, and of course the Catholic Church and a lot of the religious institutions do not want this information to be disclosed, because it may cause people to have doubt about religion, but it might actually give up some secrets that they have. I don't know. It's an interesting subject. And now I thought it might be quite fun to move into a guided remote viewing exercise with you. And I would like to invite you to have this, and remember that while we do this exercise, a few things I'd like you to think about: that you're not seeking particular contact with anyone, and you're not inviting communication. You're just going to perceive things. But before we go any further, I do want to pause just for a moment and say something important. What I'm talking about on the Talking to the Dead podcast, really sits on the edge of science, philosophy, and personal experience. And some of it is supported by documented research, and some of it is theoretical. And quite a lot of it is in the realm of personal belief. When I went to church on Sunday with my daughter, and I watched what was going on, and then I saw her go up and receive Holy Communion, she asked if I would come with her. I am confirmed in the Church of England, but not in the German side of things. So I feel a little bit of an imposter, and I don't like being an imposter. So I said, no, I don't want to do it because, number one, I don't go to church regularly. Number two, I don't really believe in the established church. Number three, I'm not terribly happy with a lot of things that the established church has done to people. So in a way, it would be horribly hypocritical of me to therefore go with my daughter and accept Holy Communion. But that's my personal belief. I believe that there were these characters in the Bible. I believe a lot of that information that is passed to people is true. I believe that religion is certainly a vehicle to being able to communicate with other consciousness. But I don't actually believe in this particular church. So I wouldn't want to do that. But that's my personal belief. But I want to say to people who are listening to this that nothing I say should be intended as any form of medical or psychological or therapeutic advice. And, if you are not well, and if you are living with conditions such as psychosis or severe anxiety or trauma, and if you have suffered from altered states of consciousness, or if these things and these discussions are very triggering to you, I would ask you not to attempt this experimental portion of this episode. Please just listen. It's fine just to listen, but you don't have to get involved, because remote viewing, meditation, or inner observation should always be approached gently and with curiosity rather than by force. And you should never feel pressure to experience anything or see anything or believe anything. Just like if I go to church, I'm not going to be under pressure to have to take Holy Communion just because everybody else is doing it. And during this experiment, if you feel uncomfortable or if you feel disoriented or distressed, please stop the exercise, open your eyes and ground yourself to your surroundings and return your attention to the physical world. As I said, you're not required to go anywhere you don't wish to go. And this is all about exploration. It's not about persuasion. And above all, as I've always stressed, it's about safety, both psychological and emotional. So before we end today's episode, I want to offer something different. It's not a story. It's not a theory. It's an experience. If everything we've discussed today is even partially true, if consciousness is not bound by time, distance, or the body, then remote viewing is not something that is reserved for governments or for gifted psychics. It's a human capacity in all of you. And right now, I want to try to show that to you and guide you through a simple remote viewing session. You don't need to believe in it. In fact, belief actually gets in the way sometimes. All you need is curiosity. Now, if you're listening to this while you're driving, please keep your eyes open and come back to this portion later. But if you're somewhere safe and still, you can participate now and take a moment and just settle in. So what you need to do is sit comfortably with your feet on the ground if possible, and let your hands rest loosely on your lap. You don't need to close your eyes yet. You first take a slow breath in through your nose and let it out through your mouth. Again, slow in and slow out. One more time. And as you breathe, let the day loosen its grip on you. You're not trying to relax perfectly, you're just allowing attention to turn inward. Now gently close your eyes. Remote viewing does not begin with effort. It begins with stillness. So bring your attention to the space behind your eyes, not the images you see, but the darkness itself, the quiet background where thoughts appear and disappear. If a thought arises, don't push it away. Just let it pass, just like a sound in the distance. You're not imagining anything. You are not searching. You're listening. Now, in this session, I want you to let your unconscious mind choose the target that you wish to view. So say quietly to yourself, either out loud or silently, I intend to perceive a target appropriate for me at this time for my highest understanding. And then stop. Do not ask questions. Do not visualize. Just wait. Now, you may want to switch this podcast off while you're going through this process, and when you're ready, switch it back on again. You may be noticing something very subtle, like a sensation, a feeling, a texture, a temperament, a temperature, or a movement. It may not make sense, but that's good. And if you feel warmth, write down that you feel warmth. If you feel heaviness, write down you feel heaviness. If you sense height or distance or openness, just acknowledge it. Don't try to name objects. Don't try to guess locations. And if your mind says this is a mountain, gently set that aside and return to the raw impression. It may be tall and solid and still. Remote viewing sort of happens before language formation, so let the impressions rise and fall without grabbing them too much. Now imagine your awareness gently expanding, not leaving your body, not traveling, but widening, as if your sense of here becomes larger. You may feel emotionally neutral, you may feel calm, you may feel nothing at all. Nothing is still something. If an emotion appears that doesn't feel like yours, just notice it. If a presence is sensed, do not engage with it, don't fear it, just observe. You're not intruding, you're perceiving. Now some of you may sense something that feels alive, but not physical. And if this happens, ground yourself, you're safe. You are in your body and you're observing, not interacting. If consciousness survives death as we believe, it does not mean it is wanting to speak to you. Silence is also information. Let the impressions pass. Now, gently bring your attention back to your breathing. Feel the weight of your body again, the surface beneath you, the room around you. Take a slow breath in and let it go. And when you're ready, open your eyes. You may not feel changed, or you may feel subtly different, because remote viewing is rarely dramatic. Its power is the quietness. If you are experiencing nothing, it doesn't mean that you failed. It may mean you listened instead of imagined, and that is where real perception begins. So, if, as I believe, consciousness is not bound by the body, then moments like this matter, not because they prove anything, but because they remind us that we are not as limited as we have been told. The dead still exist as awareness. We know they are not gone. They are simply no longer loud. So go back and replay that portion and try again if you like, or maybe you don't even need me to talk to you. Just sit in a room quietly with a pen and paper and close your eyes and do the breathing and see what you feel. Write down everything. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it, and wherever your mind went tonight, I hope it returns with lots of questions worth asking. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.